Hey everybody, today I want to talk a little bit about Lincoln and the law. So, we're really going to talk a lot about the Emancipation Proclamation, but I want to set some context for that by talking a little bit about how, as President of the United States, Lincoln had to have kind of a fast and loose relationship with the Constitution and with the law. So, let's get started. Let's start with some context. Um, and uh, and I think this is important, right? Lincoln was a trained lawyer, obviously took an oath to uphold the United States Constitution. But by the time he's sworn in, the country is divided in a way that it never has been, and so we're on the brink of a civil war. And he's concerned that if he doesn't use his powers to their fullest, that there might not be a United States any longer. So there's a long list, and we're going to look at some of them here just briefly of actions that President Lincoln took that were questionably legal. Sometimes he's going to get smacked down by the Supreme Court. Other times it doesn't make it that far. But where Lincoln had to balance his commitment to the rule of law and upholding the Constitution with doing what he thought he needed to do to preserve the Union. And we see this with a wide variety of presidents. Most recently, we talked about this with Andrew Jackson. In the future, we'll look at this with President Teddy Roosevelt. So let's look at some examples. So first of all, here's some examples of these kind of questionably legal things. First of all, he proclaims a blockade. Now, war-making power had been given to Congress by the United States Constitution, so that one man in a high position of power couldn't be responsible for getting us involved in a war. And proclaiming a blockade is an act of war, and so there's some concern here that Lincoln was engaging in war without, a declaration of war from Congress, though that would come relatively quickly. He's also going to increase the size of the army, right? He's going to do that through executive order, and that's a power that's given to Congress in the United States Constitution, Article 1, Section 8, Paragraph 12. He's also going to direct the Treasury to pay private citizens for military assistance, right? Which again would be within the spending power of Congress. And most controversially, he's going to suspend the writ of habeas corpus. And what this means is he's going to tell certain prisoners that they don't have a right to appear before a judge, that they can't petition to come before a judge and hear the charges against them. And that's something that only Congress is allowed to do, and only in times of rebellion or insurrection. So President Lincoln was doing these things because he obviously thought they were going to help the Union persevere and stay together and help the North win the war. But again, there's some question about the legality of these issues. There, I've given you a case named Ex parte Merriman, of a Supreme Court case where the Supreme Court's going to weigh in and suggest that some of the stuff that Lincoln's doing is unconstitutional. So my question for you to think about is whether or not Lincoln's actions are justified when he is kind of going above and beyond his powers. This one of those times where we're willing to just kind of ignore that in the interest of the greater good of preserving the Union, or do we really need to be cautious and make sure that we protect this concept of this idea that the law is what is ruling and no individual? Okay, so I use this to partly set the scene for the Emancipation Proclamation, what Lincoln thought was his biggest contribution to the Civil War. Some important context. First of all, Lincoln, from the day he was elected, had been trying to balance his personal anti-slavery views with his desire to keep the Union together, which meant in his mind, a more moderate position on slavery, where he opposed the expansion of slavery, but had no desire to use his power as president to get rid of it where it currently existed, right? And his ultimate goal, he would say over and over again, was to preserve the Union. So he's very sensitive to that fact that he doesn't want to do anything that is going to make the division between North and South irreparable or irreconcilable. There's also this question about whether he could legally declare an end to slavery. It doesn't seem like the sort of thing that constitutionally the president would be able to do. He also knew that if he was going to issue some sort of Emancipation Proclamation, it would need to be after a major Union victory. And he's going to get that at Antietam. And without that victory, he probably would not have had what we call the political capital to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. And then he also had this tricky issue of there were states on the border of the North and South that had slaves. Maryland is a prime example that had slaves but had not seceded. So how do we not alienate those slaveholding states? We don't want to send them running to the Confederacy, Lincoln is thinking. And would an Emancipation Proclamation do that? So he's kind of weighing all of these realities. Okay, so the Emancipation Proclamation, I think it's interesting to start with what the Emancipation Proclamation did not do. So the Emancipation Proclamation did not free all the slaves. This is not freedom for the slaves. It did not give slaves rights. It did not give free blacks really any new significant rights. So this is not the type of action that's going to have direct and immediate impact. But it does have symbolic impact. It's really more symbolic than anything else. So what did it do? Well, these are some of the consequences, and we'll get into some more consequences in a second. Some of the effects. It did strengthen the moral cause of the war. For those who didn't think that the war was about slavery, well, now it clearly is about slavery, right? About ending slavery. And again, this is something Lincoln was reluctant to do at the start of the war because he was concerned that it would lead to division. But we're obviously by 1863 deeply divided. So the other impacts it's going to have, it's going to encourage slaves and free blacks to fight for the Union. We're going to see that actually happens. Now, interestingly, technically, the Emancipation Proclamation had to view the slaves as property in order for Lincoln to issue it. So this is kind of an irony. So follow along with this. In a time of war, you can take as contraband, you can seize the property of those who are rebelling or in insurrection, the traitors, right? You can take their property. So since slaves were considered property of their owners, the Emancipation Proclamation basically plays on that notion and says, well, then we are justified in going to the South and fighting our enemy, fighting the rebels, and seizing their property, in this case, the slaves, right? And so that was kind of how the freedom was going to reach them. The freedom of the Emancipation Proclamation did not apply to the border states. It was only the states who are currently in a state of rebellion as of January 1st, 1863. If you were part of the Confederacy, then we could go, the Union could go and liberate your slaves, right? If you were not, like Maryland, then your slaves, they were protected and the Union was not going to liberate them. So that's an important distinction. The last thing that we're going to talk about here, and again, I'm going to go over these one more time, is it dissuades the British from recognizing the Confederacy as a legitimate government. The British people had been very anti-slavery, and so now it was clear that the northern side was the side of anti-slavery and the southern side was the side of pro-slavery. And so the European countries were more wary of getting involved than they already had been. So again, I want to reiterate this because this is one of your short answer questions where you have to identify causes and consequences of the Emancipation Proclamation. Let's just revisit those consequences again. So the Europeans are really going to back off from supporting the South in this war or even recognizing the South as a legitimate government for fear that their people would be upset about that, right? The French people and the British people would not tolerate their government supporting the bad guys, right? The slave owners. There was a real strong anti-slavery sentiment in Great Britain, France at the time. All right. We also do see a rush to service from Black Americans, both former slaves as contraband soldiers, and then also free blacks in the North. If you've ever seen the movie Glory, it's about the Massachusetts 54th. We're going to have over 200,000 soldiers, black soldiers, serving in the Civil War by war's end. And then lastly, and probably most significantly, is that the Emancipation Proclamation is going to pave the way for the 13th Amendment. So it's the first kind of legal step in that direction towards abolishing slavery in the United States. But that has to be done by constitutional amendment. And even when it is done by constitutional amendment, it's going to take a long time for the slaves to actually receive their freedom. So, that 13th Amendment is going to be ratified in 1865, but we're going to see that slavery kind of lingers in the aftermath of that. And that's what we're going to talk about. We'll get to the post-war period when we come back. Have a great Thanksgiving, the Civil War. This is the context in which Abraham Lincoln declared that Thanksgiving would be a national holiday, that the United States government decided to make Thanksgiving a national holiday. So, have a great Thanksgiving break, and I will see you next week.